You say that word to any guitarist and they're gonna smile. It's one of the most fun effects to mess with on the guitar, and certainly one of my favorite features to really up the level of my sound quality, whether live or in the studio. I've seen a lot of guitarists fumble reverb though, whether they use too much or too little or even none at all, or maybe their decay was too long and it was making everything muddy. It's so messy in the world of like hundreds of reverb pedals and thousands of plugins, presets, etc. It's a mess trying to figure out that stuff. And I've definitely made so many mistakes doing that, but I think I'm finally starting to get to a place where I'm starting to understand this stuff. So I thought I would make this video to help all of you understand as well. So before we go into how do we use these reverbs to our advantage, I think it's really important to take a look at the history of the reverb, kind of how it was made and all that stuff, and the different kinds of reverb available to us as guitarists. So we'll start at the beginning with the most obvious thing, which are halls. Reverb really has been a thing throughout all of time. You know, they would build amphitheaters in ancient days to try to make sound go further, and ancient churches had the same thing. These grand cathedrals that were just built to project sound through a large space, and it would cause this not quite an echo but an elongation of a sound. That's what reverb is, and it began in these halls and churches. So typically when you hear hall, it's typically a very long or large feeling reverb. And for almost all of history, that's what we had. We didn't really have much control unless you were going to build a whole room, until around the 1930s, where different studios started to experiment with these things called chambers. Chambers were basically like a mini hall, like not a large room. They could be large, but not crazy big. And they would take a speaker and they put it in the room, and they basically send a loop of the sound, whatever they were trying to add reverb to, send it back into those speakers that would play through the room and make the original dry sound very reverby. And they'd actually have another microphone in that room recording the sound, so it created this interesting kind of loop. Then the loop created a wonderful reverb effect, which became a big part of 1930s, 40s, and 50s music. You listen to a lot of Frank Sinatra records, anything from Capitol back in the day. That is some magic stuff. And here's some samples of some classical chambers that were mimicked by this Universal Audio, actually mimicking the Capitol chambers, which were some of the more classic sounds. So here's a little sample of that. So that's all well and fine, except chambers also had an issue. They were expensive. They weren't as expensive as building a whole hall or a church or something like that, but they were still a lot of money, very intricate to try to build. So around the 50s, and this is definitely the 60s, around the 50s and 60s, they started experimenting with spring and plate reverb. They kind of came out sort of the same time, and they work off similar principles, although they have different sounds, and we'll get to that. The main principles of spring and plate reverb are basically they have this thin piece of metal that is connected to two pickups, and the sound travels electrically through the metal and vibrates the metal, which gives it sort of an effective reverb. It's uncanny. It's not real reverb, but it's very similar. And the pickups pick it up and send it back to whatever audio source you're using. In a plate, it's basically a giant metal plate that they are using to create the reverb sound. And a spring, it's a much smaller, it's a tank that goes in a lot of amplifiers. They did make them for studios, but they're most well known in electric guitar amplifiers. They are much smaller, but they have that classic kind of boinky sound. That's the best way that I could describe it, is boinky, which sounds weird, but whatever. Those are the difference. So then reverb became a whole different sound and a whole different effect, because these were different than any other reverb that had ever been created. So people started using them for a much more fast pace. And I dare say that spring and plate reverb were some of the big driving factors that helped drove classic rock as we know it. And so there we sit for a little while until we get to the digital reverb. And this is where things really start to get fun. So it was in 1976 that EMT came out with the first digital reverb, which is the EMT 250. Changed everything. I mean, because if you think about it, it's a digital signal. It's not physically limited by anything. It's only limited by what you can code. So that you could get some crazy reverbs with that kind of sound. And 2 years after that, in 1978, 2 years later in 1978, Lexicon came out with their Lexicon 224, which I actually can show you a little sample of right now. The thing to note about this reverb is that it is just so luscious compared to the plate, the spring, even the chamber. There's just a thickness to these. They are just so luscious, and they're a huge staple in that 80s ambient sound that is still shaking the world to this day. And there are our main categories. We have halls, very traditional halls, cathedrals, and we have chambers, and then we have plates and springs, and finally the digital reverb. And those are all of our main categories that we have to work with. That's all fine and well. Now, what the hell do we do with all that information? It's important to listen to all the different categories that each one has. And a great plugin to learn those different categories in is the Valhalla Vintage Verb. I'm not sponsored by Valhalla, but I just am such a huge fanboy. And I have a ton of different reverb plugins and pedals. Valhalla has an emulation of chambers, halls, my brain is not working, plates, and even more. The only thing it doesn't have is a spring. Springs are very hard to emulate because of that boinky sound. But the easiest way is just to keep the same settings and switch between those different reverbs and kind of figure out what the differences are. I can try to explain it here. So what I've kind of found is that halls are very large. There's something about it, like you don't actually hear it in 3D space a lot of the time, but they feel tall. I don't use a hall very often. They are pretty smooth. I do like that. Like typically they're not, there's not a lot of rollover in the sound. Like some reverbs, you can almost hear a little bit of an echo in the reverb. Halls are pretty smooth typically. Plates, in my opinion, are the most cutting reverb that there is. If you put a plate on something, there's something about it that just slices through everything. Maybe it's the thin metal emulating, I'm not sure, but that's the best way I can describe a plate. Chamber is warm. It's warm and gooey. It's like the s'more of reverbs. It's not particularly long, so if you're looking for that ambient stuff, I wouldn't recommend a chamber. But if you're trying to get that classic sound and you're just trying to add some warmth, and the digital reverbs are tough because most of the categories in the digital reverb are emulations of what we just talked about. So even though there are different, there are basically some digital reverbs that are actually trying to emulate these, like this Universal Audio Capital Chambers plugin that I showed you. And then there are things like the Valhalla Vintage, which some of those, there are multiple presets. There are some plate presets, for instance, that sound like an actual plate. And then there are some plate presets that sound nothing like a plate. They sound like a digital reverb from the 80s or 90s trying to mimic a plate. And that's really cool. So there's a couple different main ways that you can make a reverb work for your guitar. It all depends on what vibe you're trying to go for. So we're going to go off of a couple different scenarios. First scenario, you are just trying to space things out. You're trying to get things to kind of spread out and not feel so mono. I would personally recommend a room or a chamber. Chamber, if you're going for that gooey vintage sound, or a room. But the key is to have the decay be very short. You don't need a lot of decay. You could have it around 20 milliseconds, maybe up to 50, but you don't want to push it much further than that. And you want to pick one that is going to have a stereo decay. You don't want one that's going to stay in mono. And maybe you add a little bit. Some reverbs have a little bit of modulation, which basically adds a little chorus effect. You can add a little bit of that to add some of that space, but that depends on the style of the song you're working for. If you're doing a vintage song, I don't recommend doing that. So that's for scenario 1. Scenario 2 is that you are trying to not wash out your guitar sound, but you want to just kind of fill in those little gaps because it's just feeling dry, but you don't want it to feel underwater. The best way to handle that is to have a slightly longer, not ridiculous, like I would say keep it under 3-second long decay. I would personally recommend for something like this, a Hall, a Plate, or a very digitally emulated chamber. Basically, you take that, you add the decay to between 3/4 of a second or 3 seconds. And with a decay that long, it's gonna feel washy, but here's what you do. There should be a mix knob on whatever reverb you're working on. You bring that down. You bring it down further than you think you need to. And I learned the hard way because I've had some songs where I was like, oh, I can't hear the reverb now. But then I would like listen to it later. I was like, ooh, that's too much reverb. Really, you need less. When you're talking about just trying to fill in those little gaps, you need less reverb than you think you do. You could even use a spring to do this. If it's not super loud and bright, it's kind of a darker sounding spring, then that works perfect. But the point is you bring it down to where it's felt, not heard. And then the last one, I want it washed, bro. I want it like sparkling, just like send it to the moon. That's not too difficult to figure out either. Really, you just need something long. I mean, you could still get away with 3 seconds, but you could go as high as 6. I've gone as up to 10. Depends on how ridiculous you're trying to get, you know? You still want to keep the mix knob relatively low depending on what the song is. Like if you're trying to sound like not a guitar at all, then you can keep the mix knob beyond 60 to 70%. But if you're trying to keep that guitar sound, I would still keep it below 40 or 30% mix. Now here's the important thing. Working on the tone of the reverb. For most applications, you want your reverb a little bit darker, in my opinion. And just what sounds good to me. A sharp reverb is almost never going to catch somebody's ear in a good way. It needs to be heard, so you need a little bit of those high frequencies, but experiment a little bit with it. But that's the first thing. If you're going to do any EQ editing, then I would mess with that high end of that reverb. Some reverbs essentially have what's in EQ before it hits the reverb, and what that's going to do is it's going to increase the decay of that frequency. You can see this in the Valhalla Vintage Verb here with the bass multipliers, as well as this Lexicon 224, which has the bass, middle, and treble with a crossover. Those are not affecting the EQ of what you hear. It is affecting how long each of those frequencies is going to go. If you want something that started off very bright, but then kept going and got darker and darker, you would have a shorter high frequency decay and a longer bass / low mid decay. And if you wanted the opposite, you want something that kind of sparkled, you just reverse gears. If you want something very balanced, keep it in the middle. You know, there's all kinds of ways you can experiment with that. So I know I didn't cover literally every use of reverb, but I wanted to talk about a couple of scenarios that are important to most guitarists out there. If there are any ways that you use reverb I didn't talk about in this video, let me know in the comments. I love hearing about what y'all are doing and what like kind of experiments you're running and stuff like that. Or who knows, your comment could help me or another viewer come up with an idea to use reverb that they never thought about before. That's pretty cool. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I'm going to be trying to make as many of these videos as I can, but I love it. I love you all. You all keep me motivated to do this. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.